Mornings are better with a warm beverage, even for Latter-day Saints. Meet Postum, the ideal coffee alternative and proud sponsor of This Week in Mormons podcast. Spotted on the coffee aisle at Smith's Grocery or at your local nearby store. Can't locate it? No worries. Order it at postum.com. Explore delicious recipes to tailor your Postum experience. Start your day off right with Postum.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to This Week in Mormons. I'm your host, Matt, along with my sister, Melissa.
Hello, Matt. It's me, your sister, Melissa. How's it going?
Good. We're having another twin sibling interview edition. We've got a really fun guest with us today.
Well, this time I get permission to call you Maddie, because I know you don't like it when I call you Maddie, but that's my name for you. But our guest is also named Matt. So today you have to be Maddie so he can be Matt.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
I'm all right with that. Okay. So we have with us Matthew Harris. And why don't you introduce yourself, Matt?
Well, thanks for having me on, Matt and Melissa. I didn't realize you were siblings, so that's pretty cool. Yeah, now I can see the resemblances in your faces.
Yeah, we're only 10 months apart. So we're very, very close siblings, except for the only time we actually talk is when we do a podcast.
Right. So thank you for bringing us together.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, I'm happy to do that. So Matt Harris is my name. I teach history at Colorado State University in Southern Colorado. It's called Colorado State University Pueblo. Let's see, I grew up in Maine, and as they say, I lived in the mission field. Mm-hmm. And so the church is a lot different in Maine than, say, Idaho, Rexburg, or Cache Valley, meaning that there is not a huge LDS influence. And, you know, my dad used to say to me growing up, "Son, I want you to date LDS girls." And I would say, "Dad, who am I supposed to date? My sisters?" So, isn't that one girl you met at the state conference? Oh, yeah, the one that lives 4 hours away? You want me to date her, huh? And anyway, so the church wasn't huge in Maine, but it was a wonderful experience. And let's see, I went to a mission to Idaho, so I'm familiar with where you're at, Matt.
Were you in the Boise area, Twin Falls, Rexburg area?
Yeah, so I'm going to date myself because I'm old. But I was in Idaho, let's see, from 89 to 91. It was one mission at the time. It was all of Boise. And they later split it, of course. And I spent most of my mission, let's see, in Pocatello. I was Twin Falls, Burley. I was in probably 2 different areas in Pocatello, including ISU, the Institute. That was a lot of fun. And let's see, I spent time in Eastern Oregon, which was part of our mission. And I spent a little bit of time in Idaho Falls.
Yeah.
So, but it never made it to Rexburg.
Well, you mean it's pretty close, all the places you went to. You kind of you hit all of the main spots.
You didn't miss much. Any chance I get to rip on Rexburg, I'm happy to do so. I find it to be the most cold and really lonesome place in the world.
Well, thank you,
Matt does have a jacket on, I see. No.
That's right. It's already turning winter.
So, Matt, you live in Colorado now. Does that mean you're a typical Coloradan? Like you do the mountain biking and the hiking, and you definitely have a dog, all of that stuff?
Well, yes. The first part, yes. Dog, no. Not that I don't like animals. I do like animals. But my kids I have 3 kids, and 2 of whom they're graduated from college. One's in medical school. The other one is preparing for medical school. And I have a 19-year-old child with autism at home. But anyway, my 2 older kids played club basketball.
Okay.
And we were on the road constantly. And my wife and I just decided that a pet would be very difficult with all the travel that we did.
Makes sense.
So anyway, but we do enjoy the 14ers, the mountains, the hiking. It's an amazing state.
That's awesome.
So let's talk a little bit about your book. I know you have one under press right now on Hugh B. Brown. We could talk about that if you want, but my colleagues keep telling me about this one that just came out, the Second Class Saints book. What was the motivation behind that book?
Well, there's nothing that's been written about it. in terms of the contemporary era. So we've had some great scholarship from the 19th century, the origins of the band, but nobody's written a book about, at least in detail, the 20th and 21st centuries and how the band played out. And my book is really unique in that I got access to source material that nobody's ever seen before. So the papers of Spencer W. Kimball, Joseph Fielding Smith papers, Hugh B. Brown papers, just goes on. So when you
Yeah.
get access
How
to
did
their
you get
diaries, it
access to
changes
that?
everything.
Yeah.
What's that?
How did you get access to that?
Secret. I can't tell you.
Are you
No, I'm
serious?
just kidding. So yeah, that's the first question people want to know. I just spoke to a group of Latter-day Saints in Denver just a couple nights ago, actually, and that's what everybody wants to know. Because if you open the book up, I mentioned that in the preface that I had unprecedented access to core minutes, first presidency meeting minutes, diaries, letters, and a couple of ways. One is archivists. I work with archivists in Salt Lake, and they just know what I do and trust me that I'll be balanced and honest and sensitive and all of that good stuff that any good history needs. And then the other way is that I have interviewed with more of the children, they're children, I call them children, but the kids of the general authorities who have their late father's papers.
Mm.
And so I would interview with them and talk to them about what I'm doing, why I'm doing it. For example, the late, great Ed Kimball, I interviewed with him probably 4 times on the phone and then in person for 9 hours at his home.
Wow.
And I passed the interview because I got access to all of his father's papers. So I've met more people than I can care to remember at BYU and the Cougar Eat over lunch. And I'll tell you one funny story that your listeners might chuckle at. So one of the general authority sons, he's an institute teacher in the church, and so I met him. We made a time to meet at BYU, and we had lunch. I bought him lunch, and probably an hour and a half into it, he reaches down out of his briefcase and he said, "All right, I have what you need." And I'm getting excited, right? I passed the test. Woo! And and he reaches down and he pulls out a whole stack of Ensign articles.
Oh.
And I thought, wait a minute. I drove all this way from Colorado to Provo to get something from you that I could have gotten on my own at home. And he sees this look of horror on my face and he starts laughing and he says, "Gotcha." And he reaches back. He reaches back down in his briefcase and he pulls out a thumb drive and he says, "Here are my father's diaries and private papers."
Wow.
So
Is it true? We've heard this, and if you know, is it true that current general authorities don't get to hold on to the rights to their private journals and papers, that those go to the church now? Is
I
that,
can confirm
do you
that.
know?
That is
That is
true.
true. As
Yeah.
of how long ago? Do you know?
90s. Elder Packer was the driving force, I'm told from a very well-placed source. Just a
Okay.
funny story about that. So Elder Packer was upset about some of his predecessors. When they died, their papers would devolve to the children, and in some cases, the children would keep the papers. Elder McConkey's papers are in private hands to this day, and some of the papers would end up at the University of Utah, where they're open for scholars. And Elder Packer didn't like that, and so he tried to pass a rule, or did pass a led a policy change, I should say, in which the newly called general authorities would sign their legal rights away to their papers. And so when they got called into church leadership, they would sign that document and it now becomes a legal thing. Well, anyway, he tried to make it retroactive. And so I'm told this story, he got the 70s, members of the 70s turned their papers over, agreed to do it, signed the documentation. And then there were two 70s who basically said, "We're not going to do that." And they were, before I tell you who they are, you should know that they were his Elder Packer's old colleagues in the seminaries and institutes.
Mm-hmm. They had a
So they
history.
felt like they had a relationship with him outside of course, church leadership. And so one of them was Elder Hanks, Marion D. Hanks. He said, "Nope, it's going to my kids." and for which I'm grateful because I'm friends with Elder Hanks' son, who's given me a wealth of material from Elder Hanks.
Yeah, yeah.
So
He has.
thank you, Elder Hanks. And the other one was Paul Dunn. And
Oh.
and so Dunn said, "No, I'm not going to give you my papers, my diaries." And Hank said something like, "Well, Paul, why did you say that? You don't even keep a diary." And, and Elder Dunn said, "Well, he doesn't need to know that." And so Dunn and Hanks were obviously pretty independent minded, and they had a relationship with Elder Packer, where they could say, things like that. But that's how the brethren are today. They do sign away their rights, and I don't know. What I can tell you is it became sort of a legal thing in the 90s, and I assume it's that way to this day. Before that, they would try to get papers. There's a great story of Elder Peterson. I mean, I'm exaggerating a tiny bit, but he died on Wednesday, and the church security came into his home office on Thursday and swept it out. That was in '85. And so there probably wasn't a legal arrangement then, but it was just sort of, understood that as a member of the 12 that you needed to bring your papers. The church needed to have custodial care. And Elder McConkie, his son, Joseph Fielding McConkie, who taught at BYU for a number of years, passed away from cancer in 2013. But Joseph Fielding McConkie wrote a really remarkable memoir of his father that Desert Book published in 2003. And so he already had, for years, he had control of the papers. And the story goes that when his father died, he and Bob Millett, and who was the colleague of Joseph Fielding McConkie at BYU Religion, they went into Elder McConkie's office and they were carrying out boxes, and they were stopped.
Wow.
But they got enough stuff out that was passed on to the family. And so anyway, it's an interesting story how these things end up.
Yeah. And then how you get your hands on them. Woo woo.
So,
Wait.
Yeah, I want to say something for your listeners though, because I get asked frequently, from people, scholars in particular. It's not just average people, but scholars, in which they would ask me a question and they would say something like, "Hey, can you share this? I saw that you cited it," or something. And my response is always the same. I don't have permission to give this to you. I worked for it, and you should too. It'll cost you some lunches at the Cougar Eat, buddy.
that makes me think of two questions. So it is interesting. When I think of the work of a historian, it's typically somebody sitting in archives, poring over old documents. But you make it seem like the work of a historian is a lot of working with individuals and personalities, trying to persuade them to share family histories with you. That's not what I typically think of as the work of a historian.
Well, let's be clear about something. It mostly is the work of a historian to go into dusty archives. I've done this many times. I still do it. I did a book on Elder Benson, and I visited more archives than I care to imagine. This book, Second Class Saints, I was in archives all over the country. And sometimes in the most unforeseen or unexpected times, you would come across material. For example, my son was being recruited by the University of Chicago for their basketball team. And so he and I, this would have been 3 or 4 years ago, I took him during one summer to meet the coach. We toured campus, and we had a couple of hours to kill. So I went into the archives at the University of Chicago, and there was a prominent Latter-day Saint man there, or who worked at Chicago, named Chauncey Harris. His father was Franklin Harris, who preceded Ernest Wilkinson in the presidency at BYU. And Chauncey himself was BYU's first Rhodes Scholar. He graduated with his bachelor's degree from BYU in 1933. So I knew that he was at Chicago. He was a professor there. And I thought, I wonder if his papers are there. So I looked, and Chauncey's papers are there. And I found all of these interesting things in his collection that dealt with my book, Second Class Saints.
Huh.
And for my interest, it was about his response to the ban. And so I found several letters that Chauncey Harris wrote President McKay. And he said, President McKay, I love the church, I love the gospel, but this whole ban thing, it's just not right. So you get that kind of intimacy, and then you get President McKay's, letter back. And his father-in-law, Chauncey's father-in-law, was a general authority, and his wife's great his wife's grandfather was Heber J. Grant. So he married a well-connected LDS woman. And so I went through his archives in 2 hours, and I came out, and my son was doing something else. And I came out, and my son said, "What is wrong with you? You look different." And I said, "I just hit pay dirt." So that was totally unexpected. And if you look at my book, I tell a couple of stories in my book about Chauncey Harris. That was all just from that fortuitous 2 hours, that I had to kill in the University of Chicago Special Archives.
Okay, now you've mentioned twice that your book deals with the ban, which I think, just to be clear for our listeners, is the priesthood ban. Now this might be out of your wheelhouse, or you might not have an opinion on it, but I'm just wondering, as a historian, you've delved into this, into all of the history of it, of how it came to be, I guess, removed, might be the right word. Are there parallels to today's way that we treat the LGBTQ community in the church? Like, what I think listeners are hoping is that we will see reversals in policy similar to what we've seen with the priesthood ban. Is that a likely thought, or is that not something you're prepared to speak about? What do you think?
Oh, Melissa, I can talk about that. I get that. I get asked that all the time. So
Okay.
let me say something first to preface my response. And what I want to say is, when I write history, I'm not writing to convince the brethren to do X, Y, or Z. That's not what we do as historians. I'm writing history for the sake of the history. I want to capture it. I want to be fair and all of that. But it's not lost on me that people will read my book in the way that you just mentioned. They'll have questions about LGBTQ. They'll have questions about if Hugh B. Brown was dropped from the first presidency because of his activism in 1969. Did that happen to President Uchtdorf? They'll make those connections, right?
Yeah.
And those are fair connections. So LGBTQ, what I typically say to people about that is there are parallels between the ban and the church's policies today. One would be that in the 60s, the church, some of the leaders were, some, not all, but some were teaching that the ban is a law of God, we can't change it. And of course, we see that today with the proclamation of the family. We see it with the church's teachings, gay rights. And what I always say to people is the beauty of the church is modern revelation, right? Which means that you're not beholden as a church president. You're not beholden to something that your predecessor taught 60 years ago. And President Kimball, that we see that with him in the ban, it took him a while to come to this position, but he recognized that he was the prophet. He could make this change. And my book goes into great detail how he does it. And which totally upends the church narrative in a way that he just didn't show up on June 1st and have a revelation. That's just not what happened. He was prepared to lift the ban the moment he became the church president, but he had to bring his fellow colleagues along. And that was no small thing. With LGBTQ, just like President Kimball and the ban, it starts with questions. Revelation in the church starts with questions. It's not some magical moment where God just appears to you. I mean, it could be that, I suppose. But institutional revelation means that you ask questions first, and you have to create a consensus in order to make a revelatory change. And in the very preface of my book, Second Class Saints, I spell out what institutional revelation means. And I quote Hugh B. Brown. There's a great quote that he has where he talks about, we talk about it, we thrash it out, we debate it, we discuss it, we vote on it, and then we pray. And once all of that's been done, the president says, I feel to say that this is a revelation. And so that's what it is with LGBTQ, is the brethren would have to really talk about it first. It's a very active process. It's not passive. You talk about it first, and of course you share concerns, opinions, thoughts. And then when the church president, if he feels strongly about it, then he's going to work on the brethren to come on board, just as, President Kimball would have done with the priesthood ban. Well, I'll say one other thing about this. This is really interesting that I think just while we're on this topic.
Yeah.
Is that LGBTQ, as you guys probably know, is one of the biggest issues with young people in the church today. And it's one of the reasons why there's a lot of disaffection. And the reason is because when the church teaches one thing and you see it normalized all around you, there's a disconnect there, right? And we've got good data on this where Latter-day Saint youth are leaving the church because of LGBTQ. Their attitudes about these issues mirror larger trends in the United States. And frankly, that's difficult for some of the brethren to see because they see the data and they don't know what to do about it because, the youth are following trends, and then the church, of course, has its standards and its teachings, and that's where the difficulty lies.
Gotcha. So what you're saying is it's a really long and living process, and and that it needs to be addressed because members of the church care about it, basically. I mean, I think we okay, now it's time for my opinion.
That's good.
I think we see some leaders of the church willing and wanting to address it, and I think that we see some maybe they are trying to address it, but more in a closed door sort of a way. Anyway, I agree with you that it is something that the young people in our church care about, and so I think that's why it's an issue that I like to talk about and just say, like, is this a thing where we're ever going to see change? So from a historical perspective, I think that makes sense. So thank you for laying that all out for me.
Yeah, yeah. I'll tell you the biggest issue, you guys, is that if the youth, if there's a large percentage of youth today that are in favor of gay marriage,
Mm-hmm.
and if these youth stay in the church, they will be tomorrow's leaders.
Right.
And so again, it takes people to change, and as more people change, or at least express their opinions, it will change. And I can tell you that I know firsthand that some of the brethren are far more supportive of these things than others. We tend to think that there's a monolith of belief in the 12, and that's just not true at all. And you realize this when you start reading their meeting minutes and their quorum minutes. And the difference is, are they willing to subordinate their own private views when they don't win the day? Are they willing to subordinate their private views to the rule of the majority? And the truth is, most do that, some don't. And Hugh B. Brown, man that I have great affection for, was one of the ones that did not do that. He felt so strongly about mostly the priesthood ban that he ended up getting dropped from the first presidency because of it. But most of the time, though, when they're called into the 12, they're told, express your opinion vigorously, no problem there. But when the brethren decide to go in a direction, make sure you're on board. And so that's just, every apostle will hear that when they're called.
So let's dig in a little bit to the ban and the things that are in your book, because I think that it can be instructive for members of the church in the current moment. So first, I want to know, how widespread was racism, just general racism, in Utah among members of the church at this time that you're talking about? Let's say the 1960s and 1970s. Does your book discuss this?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the church just, as a historian, I'm always trying to be fair to people, right? And sometimes I've heard from Latter-day Saints who get upset, with Joseph Fielding Smith. His views on race were pretty harsh, more so than most of the brethren. And my response to that is, why would you think that Joseph Fielding Smith should have different views on race? He was born in 1876 in the Utah Territory. He didn't know any black people, but somehow, because of his ecclesiastical title, he's supposed to be this progressive with race. There's nothing in the scriptures or nothing in the church tradition that says that because you're an apostle, you're immune to context. You're immune to cultural influences, right? And so, Matt, what we see is in the 20th century in Utah and elsewhere, the saints are obviously affected by racism in the larger society. My book goes into great detail about that context. And you see it with some of the difficult teachings that the church teaches about black people being cursed, right? Just stop and think about that for a minute. You're born with black skin or brown skin, and you're told this is the result of a divine curse. I mean, that's offensive, right? And what's even more difficult, you're told that if you're going to inherit the celestial kingdom one day, that you have to shed that curse. And that doesn't mean, some inward soul searching thing. This is talking about a literal change in appearance. That if God cursed you with darker black or brown skin, then somehow that curse will have to be removed and you'll revert back to your primitive state of whiteness. And I know that's something that's appalling today for members. And I know a lot of people and your listeners even may not have heard that because the church sort of quit teaching that for a long time publicly. But that's always been an undercurrent. And if you talk to black or brown saints, they will tell you about being white and delightsome, being told that.
Yeah.
And so the church has had to come to the grips with those difficult teachings.
What I'm frequently told when I talk with people about that is, well, that was a weird thing. That was unusual even for the time. Most people didn't believe that. That wasn't a widespread, broadly accepted thought among members of the church. But you're saying otherwise.
Oh, absolutely it was, Matt. Yeah. I have to say I know more about this topic than I care to admit. Some of it's in my book, but I just finished a 45-page article that will be published next year on these teachings. And I went through just general authority sermons, published things in the Improvement era, the Millennial Star in England. It was everywhere that you'd be told your skin would turn white. And we have examples. I've got archival minutes where one of the things I quote in my book is an interesting thing. It deals with a private discussion that some religious educators at BYU and also in CES had with Joseph Fielding Smith and Mark Peterson. This is in November of 1954. And Hugh Nibley asked Joseph Fielding Smith, the church's foremost doctrinal authority at the time, he said, is it really true that your skin turns white, or a Negro's skin turns white, the word they used in those days, when they become baptized and repent of their sins? And Joseph Fielding Smith said that, quote, we have actual examples where a Negro's skin color has turned white. Actual examples. I mean, that's not a metaphorical statement, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's claiming that he knew of actual examples. And that stuff will, one of the things I point out in my book is that that's a teaching that's really tough, obviously. And when the bans lifted in 1979, one of the first people to interview President Kimball was a guy named John Dart from the LA Times. And Dart, unlike most journalists, did his homework. He read an old sermon from President Elder Kimball's in 1960, in which he talks about Lamanites coming off the reservation, living in the homes of white Latter-day Saints and their skin color turning white. You've probably heard of it. It's a famous one. Anyway, so he did his homework and he asked President Kimball point blank, he said, what evidence do you have that a Native American's skin color will change? And, President Kimball's not being used to ask these kinds of questions. And he responded by saying, we don't have any evidence. I suppose you need science to prove this. And so what I point out in my book is that it was shortly after that interview where President Kimball commissioned elders Packer, Monson, and Hinckley to redo the scriptural index that would subsequently be published in 1981. Elder McConkie wrote the subheadings and all of that. But one of the things that they did in that new scripture iteration is they removed white and delightsome from the Book of Mormon and included pure and delightsome. Now, I've said this to people before, and somebody said, well, that was just one of the original manuscripts, right? Yeah, that's true. But they didn't do this for their health. This is what's going on. This is what's driving it. So they're trying to distance themselves by tying in moral righteousness and worthiness with skin color. That's what they're trying to do. And President Kimball is very clear about this in his private writings.
So a lot of times when people look back to this period, they'll say, you know what, people don't give the church a fair shake on this. In reality, the church was very progressive on civil liberties compared to other groups at the time. If you look at President McKay in the 1960s trying to take the gospel into Africa, he was perhaps very progressive for his time. What would you say to people that would make that kind of an argument?
Well, Matt, I don't think I would ever use the word progressive with the church and race. But your question is well taken. So President McKay there's no question. To answer your question, let's go back just briefly to 1954. President McKay, one of the crowning achievements of his ministry, in my opinion, was he was the first president to really think about globalizing the church. And this is something that President Kimball will expand on even further. So President McKay recognizes that when the scriptures talk about, bringing the gospel to every kindred, nation, tongue, and people, that also means sub-Saharan Africa. But how do you do that with this ban in place, right? That's the challenge. And so in South Africa, they'd expanded there. Brazil, those are the two sticky places for the church's teachings on race, because they're biracial countries. And anyway, so the mission presidents, I point out in my book, they write President McKay letters. We can't tell who bears the blood, as they call it, or the curse. And so racial detection is really, really, it's baffling to these mission presidents, because they know that they're ordaining biracial black men to the priesthood. And the church follows what we call the one drop rule, which means that if you have 100 ancestors and one of them derives from sub-Saharan Africa, you would be considered cursed. Now, it's not based on skin color. You can live in Fiji and have dark skin and hold the priesthood because you're not thought to derive from Africa. But if you're blonde hair, blue eyed, and you have one ancestor from sub-Saharan Africa, you bear the curse. So important to realize it's based on lineage, not skin color. And so President McKay is wrestling with the difficulty of spreading the gospel in South Africa and Brazil, among other places. And by the early 1960s, Nigerians, Matt, this is what you're referring to, Nigerians are riding the office of the first presidency. And African people, just talked to a mission president who came to my talk a couple nights ago, who was a mission president in Africa, and he said that African people are prone to have dreams. And anyway, so in the early 60s, some Africans in Nigeria had these dreams in which they saw the Salt Lake Temple, they saw the Book of Mormon. We want the gospel. And so they're asking for missionaries. And so this puts the brethren in a very difficult situation, because they can't run their own churches. And so what are the optics going to look like if you take white missionaries, senior couples from Salt Lake, and let them run these all black churches in Nigeria? And the word they use in the first presidency minutes is an experiment. This is an experiment. We don't know if it's going to work. In other words, we don't know if they're going to accept these white missionaries running their churches. They're going to want to run their own churches. And there's also another problem too, and my book goes into great detail about all of this. The other problem is that there's a civil rights movement that's taking off. And they're really worried. You can see this in the first presidency minutes. They're really, really worried about the optics in Nigeria when the church is taking heat with George Romney, one of their presidential candidates, who's a good member of the church. So Hugh Brown proposes in a quorum meeting in 1961, he says, hey, we can get rid of all these issues. Let's ordain these Nigerians to the Aaronic priesthood. That's his proposal. And President McKay in the quorum meeting tells his counselor, Hugh B. Brown, he says, if we ordain them to the Aaronic priesthood, they're going to want the Melchizedek priesthood. And Brown's response was, well, that's my point, President. So anyway, to summarize this story here, Matt. So David O. McKay would have lifted the ban. He would have lifted the ban, but he didn't have the support of his colleagues. I call them the hardliners in my book. He didn't have the support of the hardliner apostles who read scripture differently than him. He thought the ban was a policy. They thought it was a doctrine. And therein lay the holdup. And so he didn't have the support from the hardliners. And one of the bombshells that I drop in my book that has not been known before is that just before President McKay dies, so he dies in January of 1970, in September of 1969, President McKay, because of Hugh Brown, his counselor, and also the McKay sons, David Lawrence McKay and Llewellyn McKay, the three of them team up and they go to President McKay's apartment at the Hotel Utah. And they said, President, now's the time to ordain a black man to the priesthood. And the president agrees to it. This is September of 1969. He said, let's ordain Monroe Fleming, a faithful colored man. Monroe Fleming had been a member for 26 years. He worked at the Hotel Utah. The brethren knew him. They liked him. They trusted him. They didn't say, let's ordain all worthy black men. The minutes state, let's ordain Monroe Fleming, which is an obvious way of saying if you ordain one, that opens up the floodgate, right? Anyway, so what Hugh Brown did was that he convinced the president that because you and I both believe it's a policy, president, we don't have to have a revelation. You have the authority to do this unilaterally. And President McKay had been saying all along that even though it's a policy, I still need a revelation, meaning consensus, which is what the Doctrine and Covenants talks about. But President Brown said, let's just do it unilaterally, because if you don't do it, President, your successor and your successor's successor won't do it. So he's talking about Joseph Fielding Smith and Harold Lee, the two hardliners. They're not going to do this. So you got to do this. This could be your crowning achievement. And President McKay, bless his heart, he's 95 years of age. He's got moments of lucidity. They're taking advantage of an elderly old man. I'm going to just be frank. I'm going to be frank about it. So word gets out that they're going to ordain Monroe Fleming, and Harold B. Lee, who's in the hospital at the time, gets out of the hospital, learns about what the president's up to, and he just blows a gasket. And President Brown had shared this idea with a couple of people, one of whom was Spencer Kimball. And Kimball told a man, Brown, he admires Brown immensely. He told President Brown, he said, I support you 100%. And so Harold Lee, when he learned about what was going on, he put the squeeze on President McKay, who didn't want to fight him because he's 95. And he went to Spencer Kimball and he said, you have to rescind your support. And so Elder Kimball rescinds his support because he knows that Elder Lee is going to be the next president of the church. Even though he's second in line, he's 73 years of age. Joseph Fielding's 93. He's sleeping through most of his meetings. I know that's hard to hear, maybe for your listeners, but he's an old man. He's sleeping through his meetings. And so they think that President Lee, Smith won't be the president very long, which turned out to be the case. And they thought that Elder Lee would be like David O. McKay, who was the president from 1951 to 1970, 19 years, right? Because of Elder Lee's, relative youth, 73. Most people are, a decade into retirement by this point?
Yeah.
Anyway, but because he was younger than most of his colleagues, they thought that Elder Lee would turn out to be, a President McKay and lead the church for 2 decades. And that obviously was not the case. Mortality intervened, but that was what happened. And to finish the story here, that President Brown, there's so much more to the story that we don't have time to go into, but I'll just tell you the upshot is that Elder Lee, who was very close to Hugh Brown, they were close at one point. Elder Lee was just so upset with Hugh Brown. And this is just the final piece of the pie here, the cake, icing on the cake. They've been falling out of favor for years at this point, these two men who were once close. And Harold Lee convinced Joseph Fielding Smith, the new president, to drop Hugh B. Brown from the first presidency. And in February of 1970, a month after President McKay was dead, Hugh B. shows up to, I call him Hugh B. because I feel like I know him so intimately. But President Brown shows up to a meeting in the temple, and it's at that meeting where he learns that he won't be retained as a counselor. Nobody even had the gumption to pull him aside and say, hey, we're going to move in a different direction. And I want to just say something for your listeners, that this is not normal in church history. The president, of course, has the right and the prerogative to pull in men that he feels most comfortable with. So that's not the issue, right? The issue is this just does not happen. And Elder Benson and President Benson, rather, when he became the church president in 1985, November of 85, he chose Gordon Hinckley. They were never particularly close. But because Gordon Hinckley was such a gifted administrator, and because he had been running the church for the previous 5 years when Kimball, Tanner, and Romney fell ill, I mean, it would have been a travesty for President Benson not to retain Gordon Hinckley into the first presidency, even though they were not particularly close. So it happens. And of course, I'm sure people want to know about Uchtdorf. So,
Well, so if I were to fast forward 60 years in the future, right, from this period of time you're talking about, and tell people at that time, someday the president of the church is going to be arm in arm with the head of the NAACP condemning racism in the church. How would they have responded to that idea?
Well, that's a great question, man. I love when people ask me that because it was important for me that I talk about this in the book. And as an author, you always have narrative arcs, right? And one of the narrative arcs in the book is in the 60s, not the church. In the 60s, Elder Benson, he's calling the NAACP a bunch of communists. And he says this in quorum meetings, and the brethren, of course, most of them don't agree with that. And some of them support or don't support civil rights, but it's not because of the NAACP being a communist. They don't support it for other reasons. But anyway, so Elder Benson became affiliated with the John Birch Society, and any civil rights organization in their worldview were communist affiliated. So Elder Benson had been besmirching the NAACP for years, and the NAACP, rightfully so, was suspicious of the church. And by the 1990s, President Hinckley, a man who's definitely a hero in the story, if I can use that term, President Hinckley decides that the church needs to make it right with the NAACP after a senior apostle had demonized them. And so a couple of things that President Hinckley decides to do. One is in the late 80s, this is very quiet. He decides to bring in Rosa Parks on the church's dime to speak in Utah and at BYU. This is not known. So he brings in Rosa Parks. You start to get the saints to accept it by normalizing it, right? And so he brings in Rosa Parks, doesn't make a big fanfare of it. In 1998, he agrees to be the keynote speaker at the NAACP annual meeting in Salt Lake. This has never been happened before, right? They give him a big award. And then finally, President Hinckley, when the NAACP reached out to him, they said, and this is 1999, they said, why is Utah one of the last states to hold out on the Martin Luther King federal holiday? Why are you doing this? This is an embarrassment to our great state, right? And President Hinckley, who is very sensitive with these racial issues, he's sensitive with the fallout from, telling black saints that they're cursed and all of that. He tells the church lobbyist, he says, go up to the Hill and say that the church supports the Martin Luther King holiday. President Hinckley told his counselor, Jim Faust, he said, I want you to call up all of our radio stations, KSL and others, and start to run positive editorial opinions on the holiday. Now, he didn't say the church now supports it. That's not how President Hinckley does business. It was just very subtle and very calm. And when those two things happened simultaneously, the guys on the Hill changed it, and the state supported the MLK holiday. And that's all because of President Hinckley's heroic leadership.
Yeah. This has been fascinating. I'm learning so much. Mainly, though, I'm learning that I have some heroes that I didn't know about. So this is kind of cool. This is very cool.
Let me say something. I didn't write this book with heroes and anti-heroes.
Sure. You're just telling a historical narrative. I get it, but
yeah, no. But I just got an email. Cleon Skousen, the famous Brother Skousen, and his views on politics, which I do not share. But anyway, his nephew writes me often, and a nice person, and he read my book. He saw it in a bookstore a couple days ago, and he read it in record time, I guess 2 nights. And it's a big book, so it's like, whoa, you must have had some Dr. Pepper. But anyway, so he said, oh, there are heroes and anti-heroes. And I said, well, I didn't really, that's not what I do as a historian, but I suppose you could read it that way. David O. McKay, Spencer Kimball, Marion Hanks, Hugh Brown, Gordon Hinckley.
Right.
And even there's, if I were to ask your listeners, who would be an anti-hero, and they'd probably say Bruce McConkie maybe, but there's a nuance to Elder McConkie, because most people think of Mormon doctrine. That's older generation of Latter-day Saints know that book, and younger people don't know it. It's been out of print since 2010. But Elder McConkie is one of the first ones to come around. Here's a plot twist. He's one of the first ones to come around that the ban needs to be lifted. And President Kimball, being the genius leader that he was, he recognized that he couldn't lift the ban unless he got consensus in the 12. But he couldn't get the consensus in the 12 unless he got the church's biggest doctrinal authority on board first. So he targeted McConkie first, won McConkie over. And then on June 1st, 1978, when it was time to talk about this and lift it, he tried earlier, and the brethren were not there. And on the day of the revelation, June 1st, 1978, there were 3 holdouts. This is all new to everybody. There were 3 holdouts. One holdout was in the hospital, Delbert Stapley. He'll pass away in August of 78, 2 months later. And there's no evidence that he ever saw a place for black men in the church. The other holdout was Mark Peterson. President Kimball had been trying to win over Elder Peterson for a long time. He couldn't do it. So President Kimball did something that I think, again, is a testament to his leadership. He sent Elder Peterson on a church assignment in Ecuador. And President Kimball was known to do things like this. If you couldn't get the consensus you needed, find out the 2 or 3 people who were holding it up, send them away. And then let them know when they're gone, hey, this is what we did while you were gone. I think it's brilliant. But so there was one holdout the day of the revelation. It was Ezra Taft Benson, and couldn't win over Elder Benson. In fact, when President Kimball announced, hey, brethren, this is their Thursday monthly meeting in the temple. This is no secret to the church. They meet every Thursday. So they conducted their business. And then after their routine business was over, President Kimball said very modestly, do you, brethren, mind if you forego lunch and we stay and have do some extra business? And they knew exactly what he was talking about because he'd been trying to get him to lift it for the previous 3 months. And so the first person to propose that they table the discussion was Ezra Taft Benson. Let's table this. And President Kimball said, nope, we're doing this today. So he overrode him. And the first person who came to his defense is Bruce R. McConkie. And Elder McConkie talked about that we can't fulfill the scriptural mandate to bring the gospel to the world if we've got this ban in place. We can't, the second coming, he tied in the second coming. We're supposed to prepare the saints for the second coming of Jesus Christ. That can't happen until the gospel has been preached to everybody. So he gave this theological oration for 10 minutes. And I don't have proof of this, but in my mind, I have this little image in my mind that he's looking right at Elder McConkie the whole time, all 10 minutes worth. Because the others had come on board.
Wow.
And in my book, I go through very methodically how he won over each member, each of the 12. And to Elder Benson's credit, I don't want your listeners to be hung, on this story, but to his credit, he listened to Elder McConkie. He listened to Elder Packer, who spoke next. That's another plot twist. Elder Packer came on board fairly early on. And I talk about in my book why Packer was won over that way. And then Elder Monson came on board third. And so they won him over, and then they had a prayer. And then Benson felt that this is the right thing to do. He felt, touched by the Holy Ghost. And then afterwards, the rest is history. Well, that's not true. They had to tell Stapley and Peterson still. Let me tell you this story. You want to hear it real quick?
Yeah.
So they went over as a first presidency after June 1st, and they talked to Stapley in the hospital. And Elder Stapley, who's gravely ill, he said, if that's what the brethren are going to do, I won't stand in the way. Which, fine, he's going to die, right? He knows he's on his last legs. Well, Peterson's an interesting story. So President Kimball called him up. And the church, they're really, really, you guys know this, they're into titles, right? Elder, president. But in private, it's more intimate than that. And they don't use titles often in private. And in this case, President Kimball called him up, and he said, Mark, I want to tell you about something that we did today. And Elder Peterson said, what was that, President? So he never called him Spencer. It was President, but President Kimball called him Mark. Mark, we had a meeting today in the temple while you were gone, and we decided to lift the ban. Elder Peterson said, was it unanimous? Yes, Mark, it was. Well, President, I suppose I won't stand in the way then. But I do have one request. When you publish it in the Deseret News, please publish next to it a disclaimer discouraging interracial marriage. We'll do that, Mark. Thanks for your support. So if you guys go online today, you can probably find it online. If you go online and you punch in Deseret News June 9th, 1978, and you see the trifold of the newspaper, you'll see official declaration. You're the announcement, and then next to it, you'll see some old teachings from President Kimball discouraging interracial marriage. And in my book, I have a lot of voices in my book in terms of perspectives. And it was important for me as a scholar how did Black Latter-day Saints interpret this, right? Because before the ban was lifted, they understood why they couldn't go to the temple, why they couldn't be sealed, and all of that. But after the ban's been lifted, why is there still a prohibition on interracial marriage? What difference does it make, right? If you love somebody, you love them. And the truth is that some of the brethren, Marion Hanks is a great example, he's in full support of interracial marriage. It'll help build bridges. And then Elder Packer and some others are, sort of old school. And President Kimball, who had preached for years against interracial marriage, had some not run-ins, but some meetings with Black BYU students who fell in love with white people. Imagine that, right? They're in a minority and they're in a majority white institution. So this is bound to happen. And anyway, there's a Black woman, I tell her story in my book, where she meets with President Kimball, tells her I fell in love with this guy, but the apostles that I met with told me not to marry him, including Elder Packer. And President Kimball gets up out of his chair, goes over there, and he gives her a big hug. He was an emotional man. He was crying. And he said, "My child, it is not wrong. You go with the church's blessing." And so the woman left his office that day and married this white man with the president's blessing.
Beautiful.
Well, what I love about these stories is it reminds me of my interactions in my family and in my church callings. Because what you described that happens among the brethren, I see it happen among me with my wife when we disagree. Sometimes we disagree really strongly about really important things. And it is hard for us to come to a consensus on things. In church callings, it's not as often that it feels so important. So I'm typically willing to just kind of go along and go with the flow. But in some ways, it's comforting to me to know that leaders of the church are people too. And they deal with the same challenges that everybody else deals with.
Yeah.
It's true.
And I want a screenplay next. No more of this history writing. You write me a good screenplay, okay?
Oh man,
it'll be like a Henry Fonda movie.
Yeah,
a bunch of jurors in a room.
Oh man, I've had a couple of people approach me after they read my book and they want to do a movie on it. I thought, that's interesting. I don't know if the church would like that too much.
Hey, well, Matt, it's been a pleasure having you on. It's been great to get to know you. And listener, I hope you'll check out his book. Not just this one, he's got a forthcoming one on Hugh B. Brown and some other great stuff in the past. It sounds like there's some great stories in there. I encourage you to check them out. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, Matt and Melissa, being with you guys today.
Listener, we'll catch you again soon.